Ladies and gentlemen, history rarely announces itself with fireworks. More often, it reveals its turning points through failure, quiet, humiliating, and deeply instructive. Today, we are witnessing one such moment. The collapse of the Trump backed healthcare plan and the political fallout surrounding Speaker Mike Johnson are not isolated events. They are symptoms, they are warnings, and above all, they are mirrors reflecting the deep contradictions at the heart of America's political and economic system. What appears on the surface as the failure of a single healthcare proposal is, in reality, a window into something far more enduring and far more troubling. When a Trump backed healthcare plan collapses, the instinct in political media is to count votes, name winners and losers, and move on. But that approach misses the deeper story entirely. The collapse exposes a recurring structural weakness in American governance, one in which policy formation is systematically shaped by market priorities rather than by the lived realities of the people it claims to serve. The question is not why this plan failed, but why such plans keep being proposed in the first place. At the heart of this failure lies a political economy that treats essential human needs as opportunities for profit extraction. Healthcare, instead of being approached as a collective responsibility, is framed as a competitive marketplace where efficiency is measured in cost reductions rather than improved outcomes. This logic ensures that any reform emerging from such a framework will inevitably conflict with public expectations. People do not experience illness as a market event. They experience it as vulnerability, fear, and urgency. When policy ignores this reality, it creates an immediate and instinctive rejection, even among those who may struggle to articulate the economics behind it. The structure that produced this healthcare plan is not neutral. It is the result of decades of policy choices that elevated corporate interests into the center of decision making. Insurance companies, pharmaceutical giants, and private healthcare networks possess not only financial power but narrative power. They shape the language of debate, defining what is affordable, what is realistic, and what is allegedly unsustainable. Within this framework, protecting profits is presented as protecting the system itself, while protecting people is cast as an emotional or fiscally reckless impulse. This inversion is not accidental, it is designed. What makes the collapse particularly revealing is how predictable it was. A system that relies on private profit to deliver public health repeatedly produces plans that fail to inspire trust. Working families, already burdened by rising costs and economic insecurity, recognize when they are being asked to shoulder risk so that institutions can maintain margins. Even without reading a single page of legislation, people understand when reform offers complexity instead of care and slogans instead of security. The rejection of such plans is not ideological, it is experiential. This is where the political consequences become unavoidable. When healthcare policy is constructed to reassure markets first and citizens second, it creates an impossible tension within democratic governance. Elected officials are forced to defend proposals that feel disconnected from everyday life, while voters grow increasingly cynical about the sincerity of political promises. Over time, this erodes not only trust in specific policies, but faith in the political process itself. The collapse of the healthcare plan, therefore, is not just a policy failure, it is a failure of representation. There is a deeper irony at play. Proponents of market driven healthcare often argue that competition breeds innovation and efficiency, yet the result is a system riddled with administrative waste, inflated prices, and uneven access. The market, far from solving the problem, multiplies it. The failed plan attempted to stabilize this broken arrangement rather than challenge it, preserving the structures that generate inequality while offering cosmetic adjustments framed as reform. That approach was destined to collapse under its own contradictions. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this moment is how quickly blame is redirected. Leadership is questioned, messaging is criticized, and political strategy is dissected, while the underlying assumptions remain untouched. As long as healthcare is treated as a commodity, any reform effort will be constrained by the need to satisfy investors, donors, and corporate stakeholders. The public senses this constraint even when it is never openly acknowledged. That awareness fuels disengagement, anger, and a growing belief that political outcomes are pre-decided by forces beyond democratic control. The collapse of the Trump healthcare plan should therefore be understood not as an exception, but as a pattern repeating itself. It is what happens when a society attempts to solve human problems using frameworks designed to maximize profit. Until that structural contradiction is confronted, healthcare reform will continue to rise with confident rhetoric and fall under the weight of its own unreality, leaving behind not solutions, but a deeper sense of political exhaustion and mistrust. The failure of the healthcare reform effort cannot be honestly explained by procedural hurdles or partisan arithmetic. Those explanations are convenient, but they are superficial. The deeper reason this proposal collapsed is that it never earned moral legitimacy in the eyes of the public. From its very conception, it framed healthcare not as a shared social obligation, but as a commodity to be managed, priced, and rationed. That framing alone ensured resistance because people intuitively recognize when policy speaks the language of balance sheets rather than human dignity. Healthcare occupies a unique moral space in any society. It intersects with life, death, vulnerability, and trust. When individuals fall ill, they do not experience themselves as consumers shopping for value. They experience dependence on systems they hope will not abandon them. A policy that approaches illness as a transaction instantly creates distance between government and governed. No amount of technical sophistication can compensate for that moral disconnect. The public does not need actuarial tables to understand when a proposal prioritizes cost control over care itself. The Trump backed plan repeatedly emphasized efficiency, choice, and fiscal restraint, but avoided confronting the lived consequences of those abstractions. Efficiency in practice translated into reduced coverage. Choice meant navigating complex markets with unequal access. Fiscal restraint signaled the shifting of risk from institutions onto individuals. These are not neutral trade offs. They are ethical decisions with predictable outcomes. When reform is designed around limiting public responsibility rather than expanding collective security, it sends a clear message about whose interests matter most. What ultimately undermined the plan was not disagreement over policy details, but disbelief in its purpose. People questioned whether the proposal existed to protect their health or to stabilize an industry that has grown accustomed to extracting profit from illness. This skepticism was not manufactured by political opponents. It was cultivated by decades of experience with rising premiums, surprise billing, and medical debt. When reform fails to directly address these realities, it appears not as change but as continuation under a different label. Moral legitimacy in policy does not emerge from ideology alone. It emerges when people see themselves reflected in the intent of legislation. They ask simple questions. Does this make me safer? Does it reduce my fear of getting sick? Does it ensure that care is available when I need it, regardless of income or employment? The healthcare plan offered no convincing answers. Instead, it relied on assurances that markets would self-correct, even as evidence suggested otherwise. That reliance eroded trust before the first vote was cast. There is also a critical distinction between legality and legitimacy that this moment exposes. A policy can be legally constructed, procedurally sound, and yet fundamentally unacceptable. When lawmakers focus exclusively on whether a bill can pass rather than whether it should exist in its proposed form, they confuse governance with administration. The healthcare proposal was built to survive legislative negotiation, not to command public confidence. That inversion proved fatal. The political reaction to the plan's failure further reveals the absence of moral grounding. Rather than reassessing the assumptions behind the proposal, attention shifted to messaging failures and leadership shortcomings. This response treats public rejection as a communication problem instead of a substantive one. It assumes that with better language, the same priorities could have been sold more effectively. But people were not confused, they were unconvinced. When healthcare policy is stripped of moral purpose, it becomes brittle. It cannot withstand scrutiny, economic stress, or public debate. Any crisis, whether political or medical, exposes its fragility. The Trump-backed plan collapsed because it asked people to trust a system that had already failed them without offering meaningful protection in return. That is not a failure of persuasion. It is a failure of ethical vision. The most revealing aspect of this episode is how clearly it demonstrates a boundary that cannot be crossed without consequence. Healthcare reform that treats care as a commodity may function on paper, but it collapses in reality, where legitimacy is earned through solidarity, not spreadsheets. When policy forgets this, it loses the only foundation strong enough to support lasting reform. The political vulnerability surrounding the speaker's position is often described as a matter of leadership style or strategic missteps, but that interpretation understates the seriousness of what is unfolding. The weakening of Mike Johnson's authority reflects a deeper fracture within the political coalition he is expected to manage, one that is defined by competing promises that cannot be reconciled within the same governing framework. This is not simply about whether he can hold his job. It is about whether the coalition itself can function without confronting its internal contradictions. At the center of this tension lies a fundamental divide between rhetoric and reality. Large segments of the political base were mobilized through populist language that promised to challenge entrenched elites, reduce the influence of special interests, and deliver tangible improvements to everyday life. At the same time, the governing agenda remained tethered to economic priorities favored by donors, corporate stakeholders, and institutional power brokers. These priorities demand deregulation, privatization, and reduced public spending. When these two forces converge in government, the result is not balance, but paralysis. The speaker occupies an especially precarious position in such a system. He is tasked with enforcing party discipline while representing a coalition that does not agree on what discipline should mean. Populist members expect confrontation with powerful industries and a visible break from established policy patterns. Elite backers expect stability, predictability, and the preservation of existing economic arrangements. Any move toward one side is perceived by the other as betrayal. Leadership under these conditions becomes less about direction and more about damage control. This contradiction becomes most visible during moments of policy stress, such as the collapse of a major healthcare proposal. For populist factions, the failure confirms long-standing suspicions that leadership lacks the will to deliver meaningful change. For institutional allies, it signals the danger of allowing rhetoric to outrun economic orthodoxy. The speaker is caught between these interpretations, blamed simultaneously for doing too much and not enough. That dual pressure erodes authority far more effectively than opposition attacks ever could. What makes this situation particularly unstable is the absence of a shared economic vision. Coalitions survive disagreement when there is consensus on core principles. Here, there is none. The promise to represent ordinary people coexists uneasily with policies that prioritize market confidence and investor security. When healthcare reform appears to protect industry more than patients, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Populist credibility collapses, and leadership loses the narrative control essential to maintaining power. This erosion is not gradual, it accelerates. Once a speaker is perceived as a mediator rather than a leader, confidence drains quickly. Members begin calculating political survival independently, aligning with whichever faction offers immediate protection. The authority of the office weakens as loyalty shifts from institution to ideology, from collective strategy to individual positioning. The speaker's role becomes symbolic rather than directive, a clear signal of systemic breakdown. The broader implication is that political instability is not the result of extremism at the margins, but incoherence at the center. When leadership attempts to reconcile incompatible economic and political commitments, it produces policy that satisfies no one and governance that appears performative. This is why the speaker's position feels perpetually precarious. It rests on a foundation that cannot support the weight placed upon it. Observers often ask whether stronger leadership could have prevented this moment. That question misses the point. No individual, however skilled, can resolve a contradiction embedded in the coalition itself. Authority cannot be asserted where consensus does not exist. The weakening of the speaker is therefore not a personal failure, but a structural one, revealing a political arrangement sustained by temporary alliances rather than shared purpose. The situation exposes an uncomfortable truth about modern governance. Coalitions built on economic ambiguity eventually fracture under policy pressure. Promises made in opposition collide with realities encountered in power, and leadership becomes the casualty of that collision. The speaker's instability is simply the visible outcome of a deeper, unresolved conflict over who government is ultimately meant to serve. Political leadership often fails not because leaders lack intelligence or experience, but because they are trapped inside governing arrangements that make effective decision making nearly impossible. When leadership is forced to operate within a system that prioritizes donor expectations over public need, instability becomes inevitable. The tension between what citizens require and what powerful economic actors demand is not a background condition of politics. It is the central conflict shaping policy outcomes, authority, and legitimacy. At the heart of this instability is the structural dependence of modern governance on concentrated wealth. Campaigns are financed, narratives are amplified, and careers are sustained through networks that expect returns on their investments. These returns are rarely ideological, they are economic. Privatization, deregulation, and cost reduction become non negotiable expectations, regardless of public consequences. Leaders who enter office promising responsiveness to voters quickly discover that their room to maneuver is tightly constrained by these financial realities. This constraint creates a paradox of leadership. Elected officials are publicly accountable to voters, but privately accountable to donors and institutional power centers. When these two constituencies demand different outcomes, leadership fractures. Attempts to satisfy both result in diluted policy, hesitant messaging, and contradictory priorities. Healthcare becomes a prime example. Voters demand access, affordability, and security, while donors demand profit protection and limited public intervention. A leader caught between these demands cannot fully deliver either. The political cost of this contradiction is profound. When policy outcomes consistently favor elite interests, public trust erodes. Voters begin to perceive leadership not as representative, but as managerial, tasked with administering decisions made elsewhere. This perception weakens authority long before any formal challenge emerges. Leadership loses its persuasive power because it no longer appears to originate from public mandate. Every compromise begins to look like capitulation. The language used to justify these compromises reveals the underlying imbalance. Terms like pragmatism, fiscal discipline, and market confidence are deployed to frame donor driven outcomes as responsible governance. Meanwhile, public demands are characterized as unrealistic or emotionally driven. This rhetorical framing does more than deflect criticism. It delegitimizes the very idea of popular economic claims. Leadership thus becomes an exercise in explaining why democratic desires cannot be fulfilled. Over time, this dynamic produces chronic instability. Leaders face rebellion from within their own ranks as members respond to voter anger and political vulnerability. Coalition discipline collapses because loyalty to leadership offers diminishing returns. Members calculate that alignment with public sentiment is safer than alignment with a system perceived as unresponsive. Leadership positions become fragile, not due to incompetence, but due to the absence of a credible governing narrative. What makes this instability especially corrosive is that it is self reinforcing. Each donor driven compromise deepens public skepticism, which in turn increases political risk. Leaders respond by relying even more heavily on elite support to survive, further distancing themselves from voters. Governance becomes reactive rather than visionary, focused on managing crises rather than resolving underlying conflicts. Healthcare policy exposes this cycle with exceptional clarity. When leaders defend plans that limit coverage or shift costs while claiming to act in the public interest, the disconnect becomes undeniable. People recognize when their insecurity is being rationalized rather than addressed. The resulting backlash is not merely ideological, it is existential. Voters are reacting to a system that appears incapable of prioritizing their well being. The instability that follows is often misdiagnosed as polarization or extremism. In reality, it is the predictable outcome of a governance model that privileges economic power over democratic consent. Leadership cannot stabilize itself without confronting this imbalance. As long as donor driven agendas set the boundaries of policy, authority will remain contested, coalitions will remain fragile, and governance will continue to oscillate between crisis and compromise without ever achieving durable legitimacy. The language of modern politics is carefully chosen not to clarify reality, but to manage it. Few phrases are deployed more frequently or more strategically than fiscal responsibility. On its surface, the term suggests prudence, restraint, and maturity. Yet in practice, it has become a rhetorical shield that protects wealth and power while disciplining those with the least ability to absorb economic shock. The repeated invocation of this language reveals less about budgets and more about priorities. When policymakers speak of fiscal responsibility in the context of healthcare, the burden of adjustment almost always falls downward. Cost control rarely targets excessive corporate profits, administrative bloat, or speculative pricing. Instead, it manifests as reduced coverage, higher deductibles, narrower networks, and stricter eligibility rules. These measures are framed as unavoidable necessities, while far more expensive subsidies, tax advantages, and regulatory leniencies for powerful institutions remain largely untouched. The discipline applied is selective, and the selectivity is revealing. This asymmetry is not accidental. It reflects a political economy in which wealth is treated as fragile and deserving of protection, while ordinary lives are treated as adaptable and expendable. When budgets tighten, social programs are scrutinized for inefficiency, but financial markets are reassured with guarantees and bailouts. The message is clear: stability for capital is non negotiable, stability for people is conditional. Fiscal language becomes a moral narrative that justifies this hierarchy without ever naming it. The effectiveness of this rhetoric lies in its abstraction. Numbers replace faces, projections replace experiences, and spreadsheets replace stories. When suffering is converted into percentages and line items, it becomes easier to dismiss. A family delaying medical care due to cost becomes a cost-saving outcome. A worker burdened by medical debt becomes a market participant making choices. Fiscal responsibility in this context functions as a linguistic mechanism that distances decision makers from the human consequences of their policies. What makes this framing particularly powerful is how it narrows the boundaries of acceptable debate. Once fiscal restraint is established as the highest virtue, any proposal that prioritizes human need over cost containment is labeled irresponsible. The conversation shifts from what society should provide to what it can afford, without ever questioning why resources are so unevenly distributed. The possibility that affordability is a political choice rather than an economic fact is carefully excluded. This language also shapes public expectations. Over time, people are conditioned to accept hardship as evidence of seriousness and sacrifice as proof of responsibility. When social protections are weakened, the public is told this is the price of realism. Meanwhile, policies that benefit the wealthy are described as investments, incentives, or growth strategies. The moral weight of sacrifice is placed almost exclusively on those least equipped to bear it. In healthcare debates, this rhetoric reaches its most consequential form. Illness does not wait for budget cycles, and medical emergencies do not respect fiscal calendars. Yet policies justified through fiscal responsibility often assume that individuals can absorb delay, uncertainty, and risk. The human body is treated as flexible, even as financial systems are treated as fragile. This inversion is rarely acknowledged, yet it underpins countless policy decisions. The political impact of this framing is corrosive. When people observe that fiscal discipline always seems to arrive at their doorstep, but rarely at the doors of powerful institutions, trust erodes. Citizens begin to recognize that the language of responsibility is not applied evenly. It becomes harder to believe that policy is guided by shared sacrifice when sacrifice is so unevenly distributed. This moment reveals the true function of fiscal rhetoric in contemporary politics. It is not a neutral tool for managing limited resources, but a narrative device that legitimizes inequality while obscuring its origins. By masking political choices as economic necessities, it transforms avoidable suffering into an accepted feature of governance. The result is a system that claims responsibility while quietly absolving itself of accountability. The most dangerous crises in democratic systems rarely announce themselves through coups or constitutions torn apart. They arrive gradually, disguised as routine dysfunction, normalized through repetition, and dismissed as temporary turbulence. The erosion of democratic legitimacy now unfolding follows this familiar pattern. When citizens repeatedly witness policies crafted in their name but operating against their interests, something fundamental breaks. Trust does not collapse all at once, it thins, frays, and eventually disappears. Democratic legitimacy rests on a simple but powerful assumption that public institutions, however imperfect, are ultimately responsive to the people. When that assumption weakens, participation turns into performance rather than belief. Voters continue to show up, debates continue to air, legislation continues to pass, yet the sense that outcomes are meaningfully shaped by public will begins to fade. This is the quiet crisis revealed by moments like failed healthcare reform and leadership instability. They signal not just policy disagreement, but a growing recognition that the system no longer feels answerable. What accelerates this crisis is pattern recognition. Citizens notice that regardless of elections, leadership changes, or campaign promises, certain outcomes remain remarkably consistent. Corporate protections endure, wealth concentration deepens, social insecurity persists. When variation disappears from outcomes, democracy begins to feel symbolic rather than substantive. People conclude, not unreasonably, that the range of acceptable policy has been pre-decided by forces beyond their reach. This perception is reinforced by the gap between political language and lived experience. Leaders speak of recovery while wages stagnate, of reform while costs rise, of responsibility while insecurity spreads. Over time, words lose their persuasive power. The public stops listening not because it is apathetic, but because it feels misrepresented. Political communication becomes noise, and silence becomes a form of judgment. The healthcare debate exposes this legitimacy crisis with particular clarity. When citizens face medical debt, delayed care, or coverage uncertainty, and then watch reforms fail without addressing those realities, they internalize a simple conclusion. Their suffering is not decisive in policy formation. That realization carries consequences far beyond healthcare. It reshapes how people interpret every political action that follows. Skepticism hardens into disengagement, and disengagement evolves into alienation. This alienation does not express itself uniformly. For some, it becomes withdrawal. For others, it becomes anger. For many, it becomes openness to narratives that promise disruption rather than reform. When institutions lose credibility, Alternatives gain appeal, regardless of their feasibility or risk. The crisis of legitimacy thus creates fertile ground for polarization, cynicism, and political volatility, not because citizens reject democracy, but because they feel excluded from it. What makes this moment especially precarious is how normalized this erosion has become. Political instability is treated as entertainment, gridlock as inevitability, and public frustration as background noise. Each failure is explained as an isolated event rather than part of a systemic pattern. This normalization dulls urgency, allowing legitimacy to erode without triggering corrective action. Democratic systems rely not only on rules and procedures, but on belief. When people stop believing that participation matters, compliance becomes conditional and consent becomes fragile. Laws may still be enforced, but they are no longer respected. Authority may still exist, but it is increasingly contested. Governance shifts from persuasion to management, from representation to control. The warning embedded in this crisis is unmistakable. Democracies do not fail only when leaders seize power. They fail when people conclude that power no longer listens. The collapse of trust is cumulative, built from moments when public needs are acknowledged rhetorically but sidelined practically. Each such moment adds weight to the perception that democracy has become performative. This is why the current moment matters beyond any single policy or political figure. It reveals a widening gap between democratic promise and democratic experience. As that gap grows, legitimacy drains away, leaving behind institutions that function mechanically but lack moral authority. The danger is not that democracy will suddenly disappear, but that it will continue hollowed out, maintaining its form while losing its meaning.